Today on CityCast Denver, student protesters taking over a quad to call for peace. Candidates for higher office speaking openly about ending U.S. military aid. A recent immigrant from Egypt using a makeshift flamethrower to attack a group of protesters. Over the past 2 years since the Hamas attack on October 7th, Israel's retaliation on Gaza has divided Denverites in new ways. So today, as the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights investigates alleged anti-Semitism at the Auraria campus protests, I invited the Jewish Community Relations Council's Brandon Ratner to talk about what's changing now. Today is Monday, August 25th. I'm Paul Caroli, and here's what Denver's talking about. Brandon Ratner, welcome to CityCast Denver.
Great to be here.
So I think we have to start with just your job. Can you explain what it is?
Sure. So I run an organization called the Jewish Community Relations Council, which is the collective voice of the Jewish community here in Colorado Public Affairs. So we have 42 member organizations ranging from synagogues to Jewish retirement homes to Jewish preschools and advocacy organizations from all over the state. And what we do is come together to try to do the best job we can of understanding where our community is on any sort of issue, engaging with other communities here in Colorado, whether those are religious or ethnic or whomever else, and just making sure that both Colorado Jews and our neighbors are safe and thriving.
So when, say, a politician says something about Israel, they might get an email from you?
Depends. There's a lot more to Jewish identity and Jewish public affairs than just Israel stuff. But it could be something like that. We've definitely done a lot of Israel advocacy over the last few years especially. But we've also been vocal champions on LGBTQ rights and immigration issues and things that are a lot more benign and fiscal than that. So a whole range of things.
Yeah, I bet you haven't been able to do much of that other stuff lately, last year or so.
It's been a challenge, but I will say that remains a huge priority. Just a good example is Jewish Family Services, which is an organization that has a food pantry that provides mental health counseling. Like a lot of other social service organizations, they've been really affected by federal budget cuts, by incoming state budget cuts. So just because there's things going on with Israel doesn't mean there's less to do, unfortunately. Right. Yeah.
Gotcha. Jewish Family Services. I'm glad you said them because I kept meaning to talk about them on the podcast last week when the Salvation Army thing was coming up, their contract renewal not happening in the homeless services world. Because I remembered that the Denver Gazette did this whole huge project investigating how effective different service providers were, and Jewish Family Services was number one. And I wanted to say that, and I'll put a link to the show notes. And anyway, I wanted to talk to you today because we have both been following this investigation into allegations of anti-Semitism around the Auraria campus Gaza protests last year, which we covered a lot on this podcast. The hearing was yesterday as we're recording. People are going to hear this next week with the heads of the Auraria campus talking about how they handled all of it. How do you think this investigation is going?
That's a hard question because, so much of where an investigation is going depends on where it ends. It certainly seems like they're involving the right people. I know that yesterday's hearing was largely a response from the school. The hearing before that took place in, I think, July, had more to do with kind of like the legal ramifications and criteria for the sort of discrimination claims that they were talking about. And I know that in early September, they're having more community groups that were impacted. So it seems like they're touching a lot of the right people, and there are real issues. So we are glad that folks are taking it seriously.
What are you watching for?
I'm watching for two things. I think the first thing I'm watching for is to make sure that there is an acknowledgement that Jewish students were affected at the school. A really easy example is the Golda Meir House, which is a facility on campus, is kind of the center of Jewish life there. And they've functionally been shut down since these encampments started. And it's been a huge disservice to Jewish students there and Jewish life on that campus in general. So those things really happened. And, I wasn't there. I'm not going to talk about the vibes and tents and all of those sorts of things, but Jewish students.
I'd be happy to tell you about it if you want. I was there.
Yeah.
I visited a few times.
Yeah. So I'd love to hear your perspective on that, but I just don't want to speak about what I don't know about. But there are countless examples of Jewish students feeling unsafe and unwelcomed at their own college campus. But the second thing that I'm looking for just as much is the broader tenor of the conversation around this, because so much Jewish suffering and pain has been used for political ends. And this kind of college campus conversation is a good example. I think a lot of Jews are really uncomfortable, frankly, with the way that combating real anti-Semitism is sort of sometimes weaponized to go after higher education more broadly. The Jewish community is a community that has benefited from higher education, is a champion of higher education. And that's the complexity of this moment for Jews across all contexts, right? Like, things are not black and white. There's not like one side that's us and one side that is not us. A lot of folks are really uncomfortable with that. And I'm also making sure that this investigation, stays narrowly focused on those sorts of things instead of kind of a Trojan horse for an attack on higher ed more broadly.
Yeah, so I think you might be alluding to the case of, say, Mahmoud Khalil at Columbia, who was swept up in Trump's crackdown on immigration and kind of black bag sent to some detention facility many states away because he was outspoken on pro-Palestinian causes. And we've seen the Trump administration go after a lot of universities. And that's kind of a whole big thing on the East Coast. Not so much here. I haven't seen it on the West Coast so much.
Not so much here. And I haven't gotten that impression from this specific procedure quite yet, and I don't know if, like I said, we're still kind of in the testimony phase of things right now. So it's hard to say, but that sort of walking the fine line is something that the Jewish community has had to practice for, a few years now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's kind of what I'm curious about, is because I'm seeing more and more people comfortable speaking critically of Israel and feeling fired up about what's happening in Gaza and wanting to talk about that, wanting to raise awareness for that. But I'm also seeing what you're talking about, which is, Jewish students on campus feeling uncomfortable. And I'm interested in how to have a better conversation where both things can happen at the same time, where people can be comfortable going to college classes, but also expressing themselves on a political issue of the day.
Yeah. Well, that was what the Jewish community was asking for at the time of these encampments. We were just, these universities have policies about camping. They have policies about time, manner, place restrictions on speech and all of those sort of things. And we think enforcing that policy, that's all we're asking for. We are not asking to shut down criticism of Israel. I mean, just this past week, I think 80 Orthodox rabbis sent a letter publicly kind of criticizing Israel for its response in humanitarian aid in Gaza, right? So the Jewish community is not a monolith that is trying to shut down speech. I can't be clearer about that. What we are trying to do is make sure that speech doesn't kind of tip over into harassment and tip over into Jewish students feeling unsafe on campus. I recognize that's hard, right? Jewish identity is a really hard one for people to understand. It's not an easy story to tell why a Jewish person who has maybe been a second or third generation Coloradan feels that, certain attacks or phrases about Israel is a threat to them. That is a way more complicated point than sort of current political discourse allows. I understand that. But that just because it's hard doesn't mean it's not important. And we need to find a way to balance these interests in free speech, which again, the Jewish community is committed to, with safety of Jewish students. And that also means not overcorrecting, which is one of the things that, like I said, the Jewish community is also very conscious of.
Yeah. Yeah. We talked about this off mic when we met a couple weeks ago up to talk about this issue was, agreeing, you've been to Israel a few times. I spent some time there when I was a kid. And I, just what was so shocking about going over there and paying attention to the media in Israel, listening to Palestinians and Israelis who've grown up with this conflict is how much dumber the discourse is in America over this. You'd hear Israeli newscasters having debates openly on TV that here, if people were to talk this way, they'd be smeared as anti-Semites.
Yeah.
It's hard.
And vice versa. I mean, I think that there is also a dehumanization of what's going on in Israel and this flattening of that country too. Meanwhile, last week, hundreds of thousands of people throughout the country of Israel had a strike trying to exercise their free speech rights there in Israel with their displeasure for some of the more recent actions of the Israeli government. And that story of Israel as a lively civil democracy is also one that's not told here in the United States very often. It's not this like boogeyman country that folks make it out to be. So yeah, to your point, I think the conversation here is super reductive. I think it's super unhelpful. And I think that honestly, it makes peace and mutual understanding more unlikely when people kind of weigh in at these maximalist positions. And that's something that our community is really focused on. And the one thing that I would say JCRC is really working on is not trying to like convince people right or wrong about what they think about geopolitics. We're a Colorado-focused organization, but trying to just improve the quality of conversation here so that those kind of more thought out, nuanced positions are possible, and that you're not going to get called an anti-Semite, and you're also not going to get called genocidal just for, what t-shirt you wear that day, because that's just not a productive way of thinking, especially if you actually care about what's going on
there. This episode is brought to you by Kuvo Jazz. It's not the notes you play, it's the notes you don't play. Miles Davis. A lot of people say podcasting is like jazz. The real genius is in all the terrible takes you don't say. And that's why I'm so excited to be sharing my love of Kuvo Jazz, a legendary local public radio station with a mix of jazz, blues, and Latin music reflecting the rich cultures of its listeners on 89.3 FM. Megan and I, that's my wife, have only 5 preset stations in the Prius, and Kuvo is one of them. Always a good place to land. That's a personal testimonial from me. They also host intimate studio sessions with nationally touring artists and put the spotlight on Colorado's rising stars and student musicians too. From timeless classics to modern innovators, Kuvo is a great way to discover the stories behind the music and the artists who keep these genres alive. Join the community, support, listen, and connect at kuvo.org. That's kuvo.org.
CityCast is brought to you by Wise, the app for international people using money around the globe. With Wise, you can send, spend, and receive up to 40 currencies with only a few simple taps, and save up to 55% compared to major banks. Plus, Wise won't add hidden fees to your transfer. Whether you're buying souvenirs with pesos in Puerto Vallarta or sending euros to tip your Coliseum tour guide, you know you're getting a fair exchange rate with no extra markups. That's what makes Wise the fast, affordable way to use your money around the globe. Wise offers 24/7 live support and runs over 7 million daily checks to catch and prevent fraud, so you know your money is where it's supposed to be. Be smart. Join the 15 million customers who choose Wise. Download the Wise app today or visit wise.com. Learn more by visiting wise.com/US/compare. Terms and conditions apply.
Well, a couple of examples that I noticed in the hearing that I thought might be interesting to help talk about this was, here's one. I want to hear how you think this would be received by a Jewish student on campus. So I saw a video in this hearing of a protester yelling, quite angrily, "You're a colonizer," at a counter-protester outside the Golden Meir house. They were just screaming it over and over and over. "You're a colonizer, you're a colonizer." How would that be heard by a Jewish student on campus?
So, I don't want to be put in the position to speak on behalf of how Jewish students on campus would receive stuff, right? Because the Jewish community is not a monolith and people would receive it really differently. I think what I would ask is, why is a person yelling at an American Jew about alleged colonization in Israel? That person lives here. That Jew is not responsible for the Israeli government and all of their policies and everything that is going on there. That to me, that sort of collective blame is honestly exactly what that same crowd is worried about when the Israeli government is going in and attacking, Hamas fighters and terrorists in Gaza, right? So I'm against collective blame for all people. And I don't understand why yelling at a college student about, what is going on half a world away, actually moves the needle or is intellectually honest or fair.
Well, I think in this case, the person they were yelling at, they were holding an Israeli flag. They were literally holding the flag. They were wearing the emblem of the country. I'm not sure what else to talk about there. That's pretty broad.
Sure.
They're owning it.
Yeah, I get that. I don't think you mentioned that when you had given that example to me just then. But so now knowing that piece of information, again, I don't want to be in a position to talk about how that would be received, right? But I do think that there is an educational component that's important. I don't think it is a 100% true fact that Israel is a colonizing country. And I would be curious if that person understands, who's yelling that the majority of people that live in Israel, the majority of Jewish people that live in Israel are not from Europe. They're refugees from other Middle Eastern and North African countries. They, quote unquote, look brown, the way that parlance is used in like political speak here in America. And that's not to justify what anybody's doing. I want to be like crystal clear on that. But it just goes to show that like the reductive thinking that these are like white Jews from Europe that moved in and took other people's lands, despite a lot of them having lived there for centuries on themselves. Like it's just more complicated than that. That is not meant to excuse anybody's behavior on either side of the conflict. I want to be crystal clear, but it requires sophistication in answers too. And I recognize that like a college protest where people are yelling at each other is not the forum for that kind of mutual understanding and shared humanity and compassion, right? Which is why like our advice in the Jewish community in general is just like don't engage in these kinds of protests, or rather don't like counter protest and like try to, win the argument when everybody's just screaming platitudes across a college campus.
That's interesting. Yeah. Here's another example. Here's something I've heard, not just at those protests when I was there, I heard this, but at many protests. I mean, this is like, I would say this has become common in these like, just generally kind of like the anti-Trump protests, like the No Kings rally. I think I heard this, but there were people chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. This is a very popular chant right now. Is that anti-Semitic?
It depends. I think that if you take it literally, you need to understand what those folks are saying. They're saying like from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. The river to the sea includes uncontested parts of Israel right now. That includes Tel Aviv. It includes other areas. So the hard part with slogans like this is you can't go and ask the intent of the person that is saying it. Like, do you mean from the river to the sea that all Jews need to leave? Do you mean that there should be one binational state from that entire area? Do you mean that we need to get rid of Israel and it should just be Palestine? Like, I don't know what they mean.
So sometimes you assume the worst? Or like you have to allow for the possibility that they mean the worst?
Of course. Like the same way that you also need to allow for the possibility that they don't mean the worst. But I think that the conversation around these sort of slogans is difficult too, because they're not asked on either side of the equation, right? Like when Jews were firebombed in Boulder a few months ago and an 82-year-old died, like nobody asked those Jews, like, well, actually, what are your thoughts on the way that the Netanyahu administration is executing the war, right? So like to pretend that this is only one side that is like not engaging in nuanced good faith understanding is, I think, disingenuous. And it's really important that everybody raises, and I keep saying this, everybody raises the sophistication and consciousness of the conversation, of caring about people, of all of those sort of things. And I understand that that's kind of antithetical to political sloganeering. But this is not a conflict that's going to be solved through political sloganeering.
Yeah. Well, I hear you on that. I mean, and I don't hear people talking about that. And I regret not doing that. I mean, asking those people, what do you think about Netanyahu? What do you think about these specific ideas? What do you think about, bombing Rafah or invading Gaza or the settlements or taking, allowing new settlements to be established on Palestinian land? Like those are specifics that we should absolutely be talking about. Are you talking about that? Are those conversations happening in your community?
Yeah, absolutely. Like there is, the Jewish community is not a monolith. As we said, there are just 80 Orthodox American rabbis the other day that sent a letter. The UJA, which is the federation in New York City, sent $1 million through IsraAid to help rebuild parts of Gaza. Like we are just earlier this week, actually, Jewish Colorado, the organization that I'm a part of, hosted a organization here called Resetting the Table to talk to rabbis in towns about how to have more collaborative, open-minded conversations, like to give them actual facilitation skills about making more Jews welcome, irrespective of their political beliefs, either about American politics or Israeli politics. So yeah, we're having these conversations all the time.
Does that mean that it has been an issue though, that like people who are maybe, you're Jewish, you're American, you're not psyched about what's happening in Israel, you're not feeling welcome in these spaces?
Sometimes.
Is that the implication?
Yeah, I don't want to overstate that. I mean, 80% of American Jews have a connection to Israel in polling that I've seen from May. So there is a widespread support. And I also think the converse of that is, like organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace have been getting a lot of airtime because I understand there's a need to balance both, and they've been speaking a lot in this hearing. Jewish Voice for Peace support is like less than 10% of the American Jewish population. So I just don't think they're like a meaningful representative of where the median Jewish person is. But yeah, like the Jewish community is really divided about what's going on here, both in America and in Israel. And the relationship between American Jewry and Israeli Jewry is difficult right now. If you go to any sort of Jewish press, the Forward or the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, every single day there are articles about the widening gulf between like Israelis and American Jews, and within both of those communities too. Again, this is happening in Israel. There was a massive protest with hundreds of thousands of people just last week. So this is always happening. None of these communities are monoliths. The one thing I would say though is this is like a family fighting. These are not enemies fighting, because a shared understanding for the vast majority of American Jews is there is some special connection to Israel. Whether or not you show love by that through tough love or through supportive love, like there are different sort of theories there, and reasonable minds can disagree. But yeah, I mean, the Jewish community grapples with this stuff all the time.
How has that changed over the last year and a half since October 7th? I hear about a generational divide, and I just wonder what that sounds like, what that feels like.
Sure. So there's really kind of two answers here. There is a generational divide, right? Because folks that are older can remember more clearly times where Israel's existence was truly under threat. And not to say that it isn't now with Iran and Hezbollah and different proxies, but like the Yom Kippur War, the 76 wars, like those were wars that if Israel lost, like it would have just been gone. And that is not and even people in my generation, I'm an elder millennial, right? Like I remember the peace process, and I remember Oslo, and I remember like when Ehud Olmert made concessions to try to create a Palestinian state, and it was rejected. So part of my like personal narrative of Israel is an Israel that worked towards peace. 18-year-olds have a pretty different experience now. Like the only government they've ever seen is the Netanyahu government. And, the merits of what they're doing aside, that's just qualitatively a different experience. But I actually think the other thing that has changed the most since October 7th is support from the non-Jewish community. The American Jewish community has long been part of what I will just call like social justice coalitions broadly. And we have seen so many examples of Jews being kicked out of those spaces for being Jewish, for being Zionists, for being a lot of different things, that it has caused just a lot of lost introspection among the Jewish community. Like, I will give a really good example. The Jewish story is an immigrant story. I mean, my grandfather is a Holocaust survivor. Almost every single Jew I know has not lived more than 3 generations in the United States. So historically, we've always been part of what I will call broadly like pro-immigrant rights coalitions. And like, we are not welcomed in all of those spaces right now, not because our politics on immigration have changed, to be clear, but because our Jewish identity and attachment to Israel is like all of a sudden a red line that is used to exclude us. It's no different than when at CU Boulder, people would write like no Zionists allowed in the library. And so that kind of stuff has also led to a deep sort of soul searching within the Jewish community about trying to understand where we fit in.
It's this is the flip side of what I remember observing a lot of. Like I mentioned, I used to be like kind of big into this world, but I remember one of the trends probably 10, 15 years ago in the Palestinian solidarity activism world was intersectionality, was for like Palestinian Americans to be reaching out to like, immigrant groups or immigrant support groups and trying to build connections. And there were these concerted efforts to specifically reach out to like hip hop artists, rappers, like leaders in the Black community to organize tours to go see what it looks like in the West Bank and help draw connections between that experience and like, you know, the kind of inequality, racial inequality that folks have experienced in America. It's interesting that that's the flip side, that now it's these, you know, Jewish Americans who are feeling unwelcome in these spaces too.
Yeah. And the shame is, I don't think that Palestinian and Jewish, let alone Israeli identity, are mutually exclusive. Like, I can't say that strongly enough. There are so many people who are Zionists who also believe in self-determination for the Palestinian people. So like,
that's tricky though. Because there's only so much land, you know, and there's only so much political power in the land, and which government controls which land, how many people are in under which government.
Well,
that's all very controversial.
Sure. But that also goes the other way too, which is one of the reasons that the majority of the American Jewish community is strongly in favor of a two-state solution. Like, I would ask all these people that are saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Like, what's their answer to your question too? Like, what happens to all the Jews there? What happens to Hamas and all of these other organizations that are like embedded in certain parts of Palestinian civil society, right? So yeah, you're right. It's totally complicated, but that doesn't mean that you don't try. And the majority of American Jews are committed to a two-state solution. That's been a strong position for a while. Getting back to your point about kind of intersectionality work, I would love nothing more than to stand side by side with Palestinians, in the fight for justice here in America. Like, I don't think that my Zionism, and I am a proud Zionist, I don't think that excludes me from caring about climate or caring about social justice or caring about racial equality. Like, my Judaism informs a lot of my thoughts on those other kind of political issues. And, I want to participate the same as everybody else.
I want to talk to you about the politics, because it seems to me like the same generational divide we're talking about and this like intersectionality question is playing out inside the Democratic Party, where people are debating this question, and there is so much more energy towards sympathy with the Palestinian people. A lot of people are calling it a genocide, what's happening in Gaza. That's pretty persuasive, seeing the images from over there. What does that mean to you? Like, there's these young Democrats. I'm seeing candidates that are running here in Colorado, John Pedora in CD4, Milat Kuros here in CD1, which is Denver, who are openly questioning the U.S. relationship with Israel. What does that mean to you?
I think that it's, I don't want to overstate how much momentum this train of thinking actually has. I think that that's really important. I understand that this is kind of a progressive issue du jour right now, but we have not seen polling that the majority of Democrats don't support Israel or don't want to keep this relationship involved. And I would just point out that all of the people that you mentioned are challengers. They're not incumbents. So I think it's important not to lose sight just because there is growing momentum and a growing divide. I think that that's really, really important. And particularly in liberal places or progressive places, and candidly, even on this podcast, sometimes there's a sort of discussion around this issue like it's, inevitable and everybody agrees. And that's not actually true. And I think that that's really, really, really important to say. And look, I don't think that it should be a red line of America. I don't think that people should be asking. Let me say it a little differently here. I also think it's really important to stay focused on the things that matter here for constituents. When former Representative Elizabeth Epps shuts down a special session about property tax relief in order to make symbolic points about the war, by the way, right after October 7th, well before the sort of Israeli military response got going in earnest, that's just, I think, performative illiberal politics, the same way that you see on the right often. So, I don't really kind of buy the premise that there is more conversation about that, and that's good. I think that all small d democratic societies benefit by having open conversation about hard issues and getting away from groupthink. That's super important. But I don't want to just actually validate the narrative that there's just this rising tide that is comparable to a sweeping change of opinion on this issue.
You don't think?
No.
I've heard a lot about anti-Semitism lately, last year and a half or so. Rising complaints. I mean, just in this hearing, there was someone who said, like, after October 7th, there were 16 complaints about anti-Semitic incidents on this Auraria campus. So I just want to know, like, what has that meant for the Jewish community of Denver? Like, people what has that meant?
Sure. It's something that we feel every single day. And it's not like microaggressions, I mean, it's people getting killed in Boulder and getting lit on fire. It's also a choice that I'll just tell you, a choice that I had to make. It was called like an International Day of Hate. And it was like specifically targeted at Jewish people. And I had to like make the decision about whether or not I brought my kid to her Jewish preschool. Those are decisions that Jews have to make every single day. And then that same Jewish preschool had a parents' conversation a few months ago about whether or not they needed to divert funding away from Jewish programs in order to hire armed security, because that is also a conversation that Jewish organizations are having every day. And
have people been hiring security since October 7th over this?
Oh yeah. I mean, I would say the majority of preschools have an armed guard. There's always armed guards at Jewish events. Like that's always been true, to be clear, like well before October 7th. But the amount of security infrastructure that we've needed to spend, I mean, we're talking like millions and millions of dollars.
Wow. I heard, this is like, I don't want to trivialize this, but I had an experience recently, and I knew we were going to talk about this, but I wanted to share. I had a tow truck driver come pick me up because I got a flat tire and I don't know how to change a flat tire. And this guy, within 1 minute of saying hello, he was like, "Oh, what do you do?" I was like, "I'm a journalist." He was like, "What's your last name?" I was like, it's Caroli. He was like, "Who do you work for? What's the guy you work for?" Like, it was like immediately he went from 0 to cartoonishly anti-Semitic in less than 5 minutes.
Yeah. And
does that happen a lot?
Yes. Like there is such an concerted effort to make Jewish cries about anti-Semitism like actually about the defense of Israel. But in my experience, the vast majority of anti-Semitism that people experience, and by the way, that's reported, when people say that Jews face more hate crimes than any other demographic, that's true, but also the majority are the incidents like you're saying. It's a swastika drawn on somebody's locker. It is a throwing of coins at somebody. It is that sort of Jews control the media narrative. I mean, all of that stuff is stuff that we deal with every single day and has gotten considerably worse since October 7th, as people have felt more liberated to traffic in this sort of trash.
Do you have a comment on what's happening in Gaza right now?
So people should not be starving, period. Like it is not consistent with, I think, a lot of people's Jewish ethics that, let me
What's going through your head? Talk to me about it. Talk to me about this.
Now I'm just like in my head because I'm just tripping over words. I actually don't have complicated feelings about this question. So let me say what I really mean. Like the hard part about what's going on in Gaza is multiple things can be true at once, right? Like it could be true that the picture of that kid on the New York Times that engendered a lot of conflict around malnutrition is actually a picture of a kid with cognitive diseases that may or may not be in his body shape, may or may not be attributable to malnutrition, right? It is also true that irrespective of that one photo, there is a humanitarian crisis boiling over in Gaza. I think it's important to remember why that is happening. It's important to remember that Hamas started this war on October 7th by going into Israel and raping and killing over 1,000 people. It is important to know and acknowledge that Israel is trying to get aid into Gaza. It is important to know and acknowledge that Hamas is stealing a lot of that aid in order to sell it at high prices and use those monies to fight back on Israel. Like all of these things are true. There are people that are starving and it doesn't really matter who is culpable, but it also matters who is culpable and all of those things are going on. So like my position the JCRC is an organization that is focused here on Colorado. And what I want to just see is a more sophisticated conversation about what's really going on and people trying to think critically and fight for peace for everybody.
Well, Brandon Ratner, thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
That's all for today here on CityCast Denver. If you enjoyed the show, why not take a minute to tell congressional candidate Melat Kiros about us? Rate the show wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe to our morning newsletter and learn more about us at denver.citycast.fm. And remember, you can support the show and get great perks by becoming a CityCast Denver neighbor at membership.citycast.fm. One of those perks, of course, is the member meetup we've been talking about. It's coming up very, very soon at the Schoolyard Beer Garden. I'm very excited about it. It's a cool spot, and I really hope to see you there, but you can only come if you become a member. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. See you then.